policy analyst here at the Hunt Institute. And we are so excited to be hosting this conversation today on combating the model minority myth in education. I have a couple logistical notes before we jump into the conversation. The first is that we do have an audience Q&A as part of today's webinar. However, we will not be unmuting. You will need to type your questions into the Q&A feature. It is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you just type your question in there at any point throughout the webinar, once we get to the audience Q&A portion, we will get to as many of those as we can as part of today's conversation. Additionally, if you would like to follow along with this conversation on Twitter, we will be live tweeting from the Hunt Institute Twitter account. Just use the hashtag race and education to join in. And we hope that you join us there and participate in both places. I would now like to introduce today's panelists for our webinar. First, we have Leangelo Acuna, who is an 8th grade teacher at Roosevelt Middle School. He is also a board member of the East Coast Asian American Student Union. We also have Kat Ling, who is the interim CEO at Moonshot Adventures, and Takaru Nakayoshi, who also goes by TK, who is an AP English teacher at New Bedford Public Schools and also the 2020 Massachusetts Teacher of the Year. And our moderator today, we are so excited to have the Honorable Sharon Tomiko Santos, who is a Washington State representative. And on that note, Representative Santos, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so very much, Lucy. I'm so honored and pleased to be here with these distinguished scholars. I want to begin by thanking the Hunt Institute for inviting us to engage in this very important conversation, especially as we look at rising incidences of anti-Asian bias and hate crime, something that has been around in the United States for as long as Asian Pacific Islanders have been in the country, but which is often swept under the rug. And so this gives us the opportunity to explore this phenomenon within the context of the model minority myth. As Lucy indicated, my name is Sharon Tomiko Santos. I am a state representative in the great state of Washington, where I am proud to represent the most diverse legislative district in the state. Indeed, more than 1 in every 4 persons in my legislative district identifies as an Asian American and or Pacific Islander or mixed race. I also represent the historic neighborhoods of Chinatown, Japantown, Manila Town, and Little Saigon. I am a very immigrant-driven community, and indeed, my own personal background is as the daughter of a 3rd generation, so I am the 4th generation born in the United States, as well as of an immigrant, and that is also a very common feature of many of our Asian American and Pacific Islander families. Today, we will be exploring the myth of the model minority. And some of you may be wondering, what is the myth of the model minority? Well, it's a concept that originated historically as a way of labeling Asian Americans as a model community of immigrants who have succeeded in achieving the American dream. Some of the concerns and conditions that are associated with that are, it highlights a specific set of behaviors and a specific set of stereotypes that are associated specifically with East Asians, but Asians in general. And there has been a lot of pushback from the community in the last several years, and yet that mold really hasn't changed. And so for today's discussion, we want to explore what is the danger of the model minority myth, and from the experiences of our panelists, how does this stereotype manifest in the classroom and in schools? And I'm going to ask each of our panelists to please reintroduce themselves and begin to respond to the question. I'll begin with Kat Ling, or excuse me, I'll begin with Leangelo Acuna with that question.
Sure. Thank you so much, Representative Santos and the Hunt Institute for having myself and everyone here for this conversation. Again, my name is Leangelo Acuna. I am an 8th grade science teacher in Oakland, California. And thinking about the model minority myth, right? Like what Representative Santos was talking about was that it kind of applies these stereotypes of success and achievement to specifically East Asian Americans or East Asian presenting Americans, right? And so I think that when we're thinking about how it presents, how it manifests in schools and in the classrooms, I've noticed it in this past year in particular with the pandemic, with distance learning. In our school district, like we were completely online until the very end of this past academic year. And what it looked like was when we apply these stereotypes of success from the teacher's point of view to our East Asian students, we kind of apply this sort of academic resilience onto those students. We project that onto them, right? And so say I teach 8th graders, 7th grade Asian American students last year, high achieving, straight A's, but then come around this year, because of the pandemic, because of those struggles, we see that they were actually, many of my students failed. Many of my students were struggling harder than they did in previous years. And so, and yet at the same time, teachers still projected this model minority myth onto them. They'll be fine, just give them some time. They'll bring their grades up by the end of term. And that's not necessarily what happened though, right? And so as teachers, we're often projecting that onto our students and those sort of expectations. And then from the student sort of end, right? Like if you're East Asian American and you're sort of internalizing this model minority myth into yourself because of the way you were raised or whatever society told you that you should be in that context, oftentimes those students are tying themselves to those grades. They're tying their self-worth and their self-perception to their measurement of success. And so the number of times this year I've talked to my students who weren't achieving the grades that they were hoping for, they were going through a lot of mental health struggles, right? Depression was often a conversation, anxiety. And so that can be really formative and really damaging to students of those that I teach at a middle school age, right? And so we really need to be careful about how this subtle and yet sometimes people view as a complementary stereotype, like the dangers that lie underneath when we project those onto our students.
Yeah, I think you are so spot on with that, Leangelo. As you were speaking, I had an immediate gut reaction recalling when I was in high school and I transferred to a new school. Up to that point, I had been taking all honors math, and I don't remember now what the specific math class was, but I needed some assistance. And the teacher point blank looked at me and said, all you Orientals are great at math. And what I hear you saying is this notion that our needs, our very real needs, become invisible in that process. And so therefore we don't get the real assistance that we need to be able to be successful. And when we internalize that as a failure, that adds a trauma. And as we all know, all students have been experiencing trauma through this last COVID year. I really appreciate that, those comments. You know, as we move to Kat, I want to ask you this. Asian Americans, as you know, are the fastest growing racial group in the United States, but they're still severely underrepresented in leadership positions, especially Asian women. So while model minorities are bearing the burden, minority students are bearing the burden of the model minority myth, that they can achieve full social mobility if they just work hard, the AAPI community is denied actually the opportunity to break the glass ceiling. So how do you see the dangers of the model minority myth carrying on from education into the workforce? And what should organizations be doing to ensure that AAPIs are being supported and represented both within schools and in their professional careers?
Thanks so much, Representative Santos and TK and Leangelo. So great to be here with y'all today. Hi, everybody. Kat Ling. I use she, they pronouns, calling today from Arapaho, Ute, Apache, and Shoshone land, also known as Denver, Colorado. I'm the interim CEO at Moonshot Adventures, which is a nonprofit that focuses on supporting primarily leaders of color, women, and non-binary leaders to launch innovative programs in schools in the Metro Denver area. And so we spend our time supporting community leaders to create community solutions and with a focus on leaders of color. I am really excited to talk about this question because I think often we don't get to. So really grateful to the Hunt Institute for holding this conversation. So I see the model minority myth, agree with everything Leangelo has already shared. And I think we see this stereotype and the impacts of it, both on AAPI communities, but also other communities of color, go throughout professional trajectories in the workforce. And so I think in terms of shadowing and losing the reality of what AAPI communities face and the diversity of the challenges that AAPI communities face, we lose the ability to advocate for our communities, for our very different communities. And we see folks treating AAPIs as a monolith when there's actually a huge diversity in the challenges and the struggles and the strengths in the socioeconomic statuses. And what that looks like is we see less than 1% of philanthropic dollars goes to funding AAPI causes because there is this model minority stereotype that goes through that they don't need funding. We don't, our communities are fine. They're successful. They are going, to college. And what we don't see within that is actually the dramatically different data that we see for different communities. And even within one ethnic group, the vast differences when we apply layers of class, when we apply layers of sexual orientation, of gender. We know that APIs make up 6% of our population, but less than 1% of elected leaders, which again hinders our ability to really advocate for what our community needs. And what we see a lot too is Asian Americans being less likely to be promoted into leadership positions, which I think comes into the model minority myth. Because when we think about the model minority myth, it's whose model minority are we talking about? And why are people saying this is a model minority? It's because it is being forced into this box of compliance, of silence, and of erasure. And as a result, we don't get to see the narratives of leaders, of outspoken AAPIs, of AAPIs that are advocating not only for their communities, but for others. It's why we don't get to hear about Grace Lee Boggs or, Yuri Koshiyama in our schooling curriculum. And I think to me, where I see this really play out in my work, which is really about coalition building across communities of color, is model minority myth is inextricably linked to anti-Blackness. And when we think about the model minority myth, it is because the white supremacy culture is purposely pitting AAPIs against Black communities, against Latinx communities, and against Indigenous communities. And so we see then not only the model minority myth being forced upon us, but also internalizing it within our own communities. And to me, there's both the work that we need to be doing in the systems of our workforce, but also internally within our own communities. How are we fighting against the internalization of the model minority myth and seeing that is really being used as a weapon to pit us against other communities of color, which makes it harder for us all to collectively fight for our own liberation.
Thank you so very much, Kat. I appreciate you raising multiple issues, particularly the issues of intersectionality, the wedge that we are often asked to play, willingly or not, both by external forces and internally within our own communities. And I hope we can come back to explore that a little more. But first, I'd like to turn to Takeru or TK and ask him to expound a bit on the dangers of the model minority myth. One we know is that grouping AAPI people into one monolithic, idealized bucket overlooks the real struggles that many AAPI students who don't fall into that stereotype experience, and that Ignorance is further exacerbated by the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes, which leads to safety concerns, understandably, among the students, among parents, among community members, with more and more AAPI youth enrolling into remote learning. As an educator, how have recent events changed the way you interact and educate your students about AAPI issues? And what can teachers and school leaders do not only to support their AAPI students during this time, but also to educate all students on AAPI issues to keep them from being swept under the rug?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Rep. Santos. Super excited to be here with the Hunt Institute and with Leangelo and Kat. Hi, everyone. My name is Takeru Nagayoshi. And again, I go by TK. I'm a high school English teacher in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and also the 2020 Massachusetts Teacher of the Year. So I just wanted to start off by saying, like, as people of color, our existence is and has always been inherently political. And so even before this visible rise in anti-Asian sentiment, being Asian, especially in a profession, right, like education that skews disproportionately white, meant that I've always felt this pressure to both implicitly and also explicitly address AAPI issues. And in particular in New Bedford, the city that I teach in, fewer than 1% of people are Asian. So for several of my students, I'm the first and oftentimes only Asian person that they interact with. And so in a way that builds this pressure to getting these issues right, to address them in a right way. But in another way, this isn't a unique experience, I think, for a lot of people of color, and particularly for AAPI people in the United States who oftentimes find themselves in this minority within a minority situation. But through that predicament, I think comes oftentimes this obligation and really an opportunity to highlight our unique experience, but in a way that is connecting to these broader issues, these intersectional racial themes that we as a society are grappling with. And so that's the kind of approach that I try to go through things with. And so in the light of, right, these anti-Asian rhetoric and hate crimes rising, in particular, the Atlanta shootings, right, in March, it was a moment for me to articulate to my students, right, A, what it feels like to be an Asian in America today, and B, how can I connect these personal reflections to broader reflections on race and identity and social justice in our country. I remember I was in a Zoom class and I did these breakout rooms. And as I was making the rounds to make sure that my students were on task, I entered a room where two of my students, both were non-Asian POC students, were talking about Trump's Kung Flu virus comments and rhetoric. And as soon as they noticed that I was in the room, they switched back to the task at hand. But I actually redirected the conversation back to their initial, discussion because I felt it was important. And one of the girls didn't see how calling COVID-19 the China virus actually perpetuated a stigma and bias against people who looked like me until I said, hey, this is how it's personally affecting me. And another student commented on how Trump's rhetoric reminded them of how the president similarly has demonized BIPOC communities as thugs and criminals. And I share this example, right, because it was a moment that I felt we were enacting one of my favorite quotes by Lila Watson on how our oppression, how our liberation are all connected. If you come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And I think it's this point that I think has wider application for teachers and school leaders, because what oftentimes happens in schools is that we treat these issues in isolation. An event happens, and if we're lucky, we share resources or set up a lesson in a one and done manner on API issues, on Black issues, on LGBTQ+ issues, without connecting any of those separate issues to a broader ongoing conversation about race and identity in our communities. And so when we unpack these API issues, we can't address it in isolation. And there's a lot of reactionary push against doing so, but it's important that our educators have to be brave, right, to address these uncomfortable truths of our past and our presence. Because the same kind of societal ills that killed George Floyd or fueled the Capitol Hill insurrection are the same societal ills that are exacerbating the anti-Asian hate crimes that are happening in our country right now. And so whether we call it systemic racism or white supremacy, we have an obligation to show to our students, especially our students of color, that these issues are inextricably bound together, and that our best bet at overcoming them is by standing in solidarity and fighting it together. The final note that I wanted to say is a little bit more personal. As an Asian kid, right, I oftentimes felt that I was an afterthought, in conversations about race. And when we talk about race in the US, it's oftentimes done in this black and white binary context. And what that does is it indirectly signals to AAPI students that these conversations aren't for them and they can opt out. And I think the same principle applies when we're talking about AAPI issues as well. When we neglect to connect these issues to this broader narrative, this broader conversation, we fail to engage everyone. And just as Black, Latinx, Indigenous, LGBTQ+ issues are API issues are Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and LGBTQ+ issues.
Thank you, TK. You really hit the nail on the head, and I so appreciate you. I also use that as one of my favorite quotes, which, by the way, Layla Watson is a Pacific Indigenous woman from the Pacific Islanders. So it is important, I think, that we recognize that we are one. No one has the corner on, the right solution. And in fact, if we are all going to benefit, we're all going to have to work together to achieve that sense of liberation for all. So thank you so much for speaking to those issues. You're all leaders, educators working on issues of racial diversity and representation or teaching students about it, but you're also part of the AAPI community working within these systems on a daily basis. Can you share more with us about how your AAPI identity intersects with your work? I think TK used one example in his interaction with students. But as well as any specific strategies that you've used to find support and success when the structures, policies, and behaviors in your workplace create obstacles and challenges for you. Why don't we begin with Kat?
Yes, I love this question. So I identify as Asian American, queer, Chinese American, multiracial, and I would say all of those identities for me are completely intertwined with everything that I do, with who I am, how I show up, how people see me. And for me, my Asianness is also inextricable from my queerness. And I see those really go hand in hand. And I see it in bringing with me strengths in how I navigate non-binary worlds and trying to disrupt the binary that TK brought up, this white, black racial binary, and being Asian, and my existence in and of itself disrupting that, as well as the gender binary of male and female. Something for me that I was thinking about, TK, when you said that, New Bedford, it's not a ton of Asian population. So I grew up in Connecticut. I taught 4th grade in rural Mississippi. Then I worked in a nonprofit in Arkansas, and now I live in Denver. And so Asians have always been a minority in every place that I've lived. And for me, having a community that is cross states, that is across the country, has been so important in me having sustainability and staying in education, in pushing my own thinking, even when I don't necessarily have a majority presence of people who share my racial identity, which also, as a multiracial Asian, there's so many different layers to it. Mm-hmm. And so I think a lot about, for me, workplace structures, policies, behaviors have to disrupt this idea of only tending to the majority, because it always is going to marginalize identities that often, because of very intentional, immigration patterns, government structures and policies that dictated where people live, who gets to have certain land. Asians are purposely minoritized. And so for me, part of it goes to how are we actually designing our spaces and our structures for the margins? And in doing that, just how I believe when we design for queer, trans, people of color, it actually makes all environments safer and more welcoming and more inclusive for all folks, whether people identify as cisgender or trans or queer. And so for me, that's a big part of it. I think the other part is how do we continue to create connections across states, across organizations? How do we build this national API community where people can really tap in, and that educator in rural Mississippi can say, oh, great, I'm connected to this broader community and I feel seen, I feel heard and loved, and it makes me more sustained in my work wherever I live. And I think the last thing is, how do we continue to disrupt the narrative of pitting communities of color against each other? And I think about that a lot with the anti-Asian violence that Representative Santos brought up, where the media coverage is consistently showing perpetrators of these attacks as Black and Latino males, when we know actually, statistically, majority of these attacks are carried out by white men. And so how are we not allowing the media, how are we not allowing different like narratives that we see in workforces to actually pit us against each other? And how do we actually take control of that narrative and figure out ways that we can be creating policies that are not against one another, or not, discriminating against a different group, but actually serving everybody collectively.
Thank you, Kat. Leangelo, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that Kat hit a number of points that I too share. I think particularly when you were talking about communities across state lines in a nationwide context, because as I mentioned earlier, like I'm on the board of directors with the East Coast Asian American Student Union. And so what we do, it's a lot of community organizing across the East Coast in different pockets. And so what I've learned in my time with ICASU is that at the end of the day, community organizing is about relationship building, right? Like, how can we forge this network of connections with people who come from different places, have different perceptions? How can we connect folks in the Duke Triangle area of North Carolina with the folks in Philly, with the folks in Virginia, where I'm from, to DC? And how can we all like organize together on the same sort of issues that we care about? And so for me, like thinking about like how to forge those relationships and how to build something long lasting coalition wise is important. And that's on a much more macro scale, right? But the same thing happens in my school building and with the other teachers and staff that are there, right? At the end of the day, it's about how are you building relationships? What does it mean? What do we owe to each other? How are we be in community with one another in a school setting, in a community that is, I personally teach in a school and community that's majority API. And so how are we making sure that all those voices, the diversity of the API community is represented there? And that also brings to a second point when I think about my own identity as I'm a Filipino, Okinawan American. I'm from the South, Virginia. And so I don't necessarily always fit with what quote unquote Asian American is presenting or what is being talked about in the larger context, right? Like I'm not always, I personally am not fearing for attack based on Asian hate crimes because I'm not East Asian presenting. All these other things like that, I've had to try and find where I fit in the Asian American diaspora, the larger API population. And so I'm always conscious of that when working in these spaces. So I always try to really make sure that all the voices are being represented in these sort of settings. Like, are Southeast Asians being brought into the conversation? Are we acknowledging the Pacific Islander point of view? Like, do the Pacific Islanders even want to be part of this conversation? And so like, it's a really, really important thing to always be conscious about because of how diverse this community is. And until we, disaggregate the population in the community, we just have to keep that in mind as we're working through these issues.
Thank you, Leangelo. And I'm so glad that you brought up the issue of disaggregating the data. That is so key to being able to, if you will, reveal the narratives that are so complex and so diverse, and really challenge the notion of that monolithic model minority myth. But let me turn now to TK. I know you've already talked about your specific interaction with your student. What about some of your interactions with your colleagues? And what have you found as specific strategies that you've employed?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to follow up. I co-sign everything that's been said. I do want to talk about representation, and it's important, especially in the workplace. You talked about colleagues of mine. In Massachusetts, 90% of our educators are white. Compare that to the 40% an increasing number of students who identify as people of color, right? And so for me, representation is super important. I'm the advisor to the Film Analysis Club at New Bedford High. And there was a year where 2/3 of the students were all Asian. And at my school of about 2,000 people, that's virtually every Asian student. And the reason I share this is because it shows that identity matters, right? My race played an important factor in the makeup of this club. And in a landscape that's in short supply of educators of color, especially those of AAPI descent, many of my Asian students were hungry for an adult role model who looked like them. And so that's a big challenge, right? This idea of underrepresentation. And to top it off, right, echoing some of the concerns that the other panelists have raised, there's this issue of us being treated like a monolith. The Asian racial umbrella is the largest and the most diverse racial category, and yet we're constantly homogenized. All Asians are the same. But when you disaggregate the data, we have those differences in geographic region, or socioeconomic disparities, linguistic, historical differences. And even the Film Analysis Club that I'm in, right, I have anywhere between a biracial adoptee to Hujanese students, kids whose parents came as professional workers, a student whose parents were Vietnamese boat refugees, to my parents, right, who were Japanese Americans who came in the 80s. And yet, because we're underrepresented, because we're treated as a monolith, there's so much that's lost. We talked about invisibility, lack of representation in the curriculum, inability for schools to provide things like interpreters, the lack of recognitions of holidays that relate to our API communities. And I think there's also a subversive thing that tends to happen, speaking of what colleagues tend to do. The humanity of a lot of our Asian students or Asian people are oftentimes flattened. There's a Harvard affirmative action case, which I think the whole case is stupid, to be clear. But something that was revealing in this case was that a lot of admissions officers tend to think or categorize Asian students as lacking in these subjective factors, things that relate to personality. And Asian applicants have been routinely dismissed as lacking in things like charisma, bravery, leadership. And it's not too distant from some of the things that I've heard my colleagues say when they're describing their own Asian kids. It's all homogenized. They're smart, they're well-behaved, right? And I think there's something that takes away, right? And going back to what Kat was saying about the lack of philanthropic investment, because we think that Asian students are doing all right, to what Leangelo was saying about this sort of resilience mentality that's projected onto these students, I think there's a lot that kind of falls between the cracks. Anyway, this question was about solutions. I wanted to talk about sort of the strategies, and it'd be remiss of me not to say, well, diversity matters. And I'm looking in one of the questions, and I think Amy talked about affirmative action. I had an Asian student come to me years ago, pissed off, railing against affirmative action policies in college, claiming that, well, we are Asian and model minorities, and here we are being sidelined by Black and Latinx students in the college admissions process. And there's so much to unpack there. And I did unpack that conversation with my student, but for me, it was a moment that made me recognize that who but an Asian adult who similarly grappled with those misconceptions growing up Asian could have guided her to understand that those sense of resentment that she was building was ahistorical, that it was misplaced. Who but an Asian adult has that credibility and authority that comes with lived experience to guide and tell this student that she should recognize the anti-Blackness, the light skin privilege, and also our need, right, to stand in solidarity with other communities of color. And so that's why, for me, a solution and a strategy is representation. And I'm a huge advocate for diversifying our workforce in general, but particularly in education. It's because we as people of color have that ability to model what it means to exist as a race in a society that, by and large, let's be real, refuses to talk about it.
There is so much that we could explore in all of your comments. I do want to stick, though, to a couple of things that have come up and pick up on a question that's coming out of our audience, which is really about what what we can do, the system in education, what you can do as individual educators, what the society can do to help better utilize data to help reveal those nuances in AAPI student experiences and needs. Would something like this event help sort of push that that need forward, or that call forward? Do you have other ideas? And while you're all thinking, maybe one of the things I will say, the other thing that really struck me is it seems like I might be the only West Coast Asian on this call, which I think is really unusual, given that the bulk of, at least historically, the bulk of the Asian Pacific American history was created largely on the West Coast, and that a lot of our larger societal impressions of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders stem from, if not the international experiences of Americans and white society, but on specifically the historical West Coast experiences of America and the white society. And so I'm curious to know whether you as practitioners, and frankly, there's also a generational issue here, I hate to admit, whether you see that in this conversation, because I'm just so struck by some of the things that you're saying and the experiences that I've had as a policymaker in Washington State.
I can jump in. I think just because I'm raised in Virginia, I'm currently in Virginia, but I teach in Oakland, California. And so the how do I say this? I think it's really important to recognize the differences geographically, like they're important. Like it makes total sense that culturally and then socially, like all these things are happening differently based on where people are living, right? And so I find that although the narrative overall, like around Asian American community, like is, like you said, like maybe the West Coast is like very front facing of it. That's kind of the thing with like the East Coast communities here, like they are thriving. And if anything, they're feistier than the ones on the West Coast. Like I noticed that like when we are in communities where it's white majority, where the resources are slim, like we have to work harder, we have to organize harder and smarter. And so it's really, I've seen great work on the ground in these like more local East Coast or just non-West Coast communities. I think of Duke in particular, because like I know some folks who are working on the Asian American Studies working group. And so the tenacity that that group has in the community is far beyond what I've already seen in the Oakland sort of community, just on the nature of like the energy around it. I have no like, obviously like no scientific or whatever analysis of it overall, but there's a form of complacency I'm noticing when like resources and community is readily available on the West Coast versus like in these smaller communities where we really do have to, it's very tight knit, everyone knows each other. We do have to like fight for the scraps of the resources. We're competing with all these different interests, right? So I think that it's really important to recognize those differences. And, you know, I tried my best to like stoke those flames in like folks on the East Coast, because it is really important when we all share this goal of like liberation and all those different things.
That's so interesting. I appreciate both Representative Santos and Leangelo. It's so interesting to hear. I think because I've never lived on the west. Denver's the most west I've lived, and it's interesting because all of, when I think about the places I've lived, they all have a very rich, sometimes very very sad history of Asian Americans and communities. But it's often not something that's taught in school. It's not something anyone talks about. And some people don't even know the history. A lot of people don't, because it's, you know, intentionally erased or deprioritized. And so where I lived in rural Arkansas, we lived 10 minutes from the memorial site of one of the internment camps. And the students in the local high schools, a town of less than 2,000, didn't even know the history of Japanese internment camps, even though we lived 10 minutes from down the road. And I think, to me, when I think about what do we need to be doing to ensure diversity, as TK kind of shared, at all levels of leadership and representation? And then what else do we need to do to make sure that once the diversity is there, how do people feel welcomed, seen, valued, so that they want to stay? And I see that not just in organizations, but in actual communities, in towns, in cities. What is it currently in Denver? There's the API community is working to revitalize the historic Chinatown and take down a sign that has a kind of a racist description of riots that happened in fighting for Chinese rights. And so I think, what's the next step then? So we get folks, once we get folks and hold them in these leadership positions, how do we ensure that they can truly bring their full selves? And then after that, how do we create systems to ensure this isn't just this one leader, but there's a whole pathway coming after them to follow suit? And for leaders who are different from them, from leaders who have different identities, different intersections.
Kat, you have sort of spoken a little bit, and I'm going to read the question that's coming from one of our audience members, and I'll just read it simply because I think it's an interesting premise. In working towards diversifying the teaching profession, Asian American teachers have spoken to their parents' disappointment when they chose to become a teacher, since from their perspective, it is such a low-paying profession that isn't viewed as being laudable. As we work to diversify the teaching workforce to ensure it is reflective of our student population, how can we better recruit and support Asian American teachers? TK, what do you think?
Oh, that's a hard question. I think about it all the time. Yeah, I mean, let's be real, even outside of the sort of racialized context, teaching is not a profession that's considered desirable for people, period. And so I think societally, we need to structure and reframe educators and the profession as a place of joy, as a place of excitement, a place of advocacy, a place of community relations, and make sure that our educators are being treated with the respect that they deserve. And so I think there's a lot of societal things that need to be done so that we're both legally, financially, and structurally supporting our educators, so that, not just API students, but all students look at this as a profession that they want to go into. But secondly, I think it's important that spaces like this and our ability as educators to talk about our stories matter. Outside of opportunities like this, oftentimes students, people don't hear of the impact and the joy and the excitement, right, that teaching can bring to me. And bereft of those opportunities, right, I think a lot of people have a very misconstrued understanding of what teaching can be like and what it's about. And that limits their imagination. And so it's so important that we not only highlight and increase those representation, it's almost like a chicken and egg situation, but allow moments and opportunities for those stories to be able to be shared.
Leangelo, what do you think?
I think that I run the risk of answering this question because my mother is in the room with me. What I've gleaned from my conversations about becoming a teacher, when I at one point also really intended to be a doctor. I really wanted to be a pediatrician. I was on the path, but then realized that it wasn't really for me. And then one thing led to another. I eventually landed myself at being a teacher. And the thing about it is, what I've come to understand it to be, it is about stability, financial stability, right? And so what TK was talking about, right, it's not necessarily a profession that is by society standards, like something that is lauded, unlike in other communities around the world. And that's reflected in the pay that teachers are receiving, right? The pay versus the amount of work and the type of work that we're in is something's missing. And so it's just interesting to me, like thinking about like what overall society values, because we can really see that based on like what folks are getting paid, right? I have a number of friends in Washington, DC, in the DMV area, and they often are consultants, and no shade to consultants, but like the amount of work that they put in versus the amount of money they receive, there's a disconnect. And so when I'm thinking about like what, it's just a reflection of what society really values. And what it's saying is that we don't value our teachers. We don't value education in our of our students. We don't really value what we're investing in the next generation, right? And so what that looks like is to really change that narrative. How can we shift this idea and really like uphold education to this standard and this where it should be? Because again, we are literally molding the minds of the future. And so to me, I think that's where it kind of comes from, that disconnect when it comes to parents and who have their children go into teaching. And so in order to encourage more folks to go into that profession, we really have to change like the overall perception, so socially, for the teaching profession and education.
You know, one of the things that I think is so interesting about the question to begin with is our whole conversation, I think, rests on the idea that as Asian American Pacific Islanders, not only collectively are we uniquely diverse in our specific ethnic identities, but even as individuals, obviously, Kat, I think you really hit that one, where we carry multiple identities in ourselves, and we cannot sort of aggregate a narrative just because someone presents with an Asian face or does not, I think, as Leangelo is pointing out. And what I find very interesting about the question is, as I said, one of my parents is an immigrant, and I was raised in an immigrant community. And in my community, being a teacher was considered a very high, honorable, laudable profession, that it required a person of certain type of character to be able to become the teacher. And so what I'm hearing in a little bit in the question, but also I think in the responses that I've heard from Leangelo and TK are that both we as Asian Pacific Islander community members, we have truly internalized that sort of American value system about where do educators sit in the whole socioeconomic spectrum of both respect as well as of pay. And we know that there is a direct correlation between both of those things. And so it's not just, I mean, let's face it, I chair the House Education Committee in the state of Washington. We have a teacher shortage, period. Yes, we need more diverse teachers, but that's been because our education system was built by and for a white society. So we start from a place of needing to catch up from the beginning. But I want to talk about another question around intersections. And I'm going to throw this one first to Kat and ask Leangelo and TK to join in. The question is really about how do we take an intersectional approach to combating hate crimes and violence against AAPIs, especially in the context of schools and schools with SROs or law enforcement in place. How do we center shared interests in counteracting hate crimes and still avoid the negative impacts on Black and Hispanic communities that might result from increased policing and surveillance? And I think some of you have talked about coalition building. That's an old idea from the 60s, collaboration. Kat, why don't you start us off?
Thank you, Representative Santos. And I'm so excited that we're talking about this question. I appreciate Amy for putting this in the Q&A too, because I think it's this is a real tension that we've seen, especially over this last year, in what do we do with this increasingly high levels of anti-Asian violence, and at the same time, increasingly high rates of police brutality against Black and Latinx communities. And so to me, there's a huge need for us to move away from this carceral state and to move away from an over-reliance on punishment and policing. And I think that part of that requires us to disrupt our idea of what solutions look like from the status quo currently, and to really go into seeing the interconnectedness of all of these different issues, and how, children getting to learn about different communities than their own and having both windows and mirrors into others' cultures and their own cultures is connected to violence that happens later on, when people don't understand, have grown up being taught hate against other communities. And so to me, there is a requirement that whenever we're looking at some kind of problem that we're facing, that other communities are facing, we have to take an intersectional approach to say, what is the impact? And also, how is this connected to other violence that we are seeing with other communities? How is this connected to the insurrection at the Capitol? And how does that then tell us what solutions we need to be going towards without relying on a system that was never built for us, as Representative Santos said. Just like the education system was built for white society, the policing system was built to maintain a white society. And how do we ensure that when we're coming up with solutions, we're not resting on a system that was actually made not for us? And part of that, I think, is this idea of assimilation. How have we internalized different values that are actually not from our ancestors? And to me, I've been really excited about the conversation about defunding and abolitionism, and learning more about the conversation of community care and community responsibility, which I believe is going to not just help us with anti-Asian violence, but violence broadly in our society too.
Thank you. Leangelo or TK?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit about this. I'm really glad that we're addressing this question because I have a lot of concerns about it, right? Because obviously police brutality is nothing new, but it has been sensationalized. It's been uplifted in this past year in particular. And I think just like on the point of intersectionality and making sure that all the voices and every angle we can really approach a policy or a situation can really be considered, because we are not always, in my mind, we're not always thinking about how it can affect these other communities, what we're doing on one particular issue. For example, when we're thinking about, I believe recently Congress passed an anti-Asian hate crime bill, which has been really celebrated in the API community. And yet when we actually look at the bill, what it is denoting is that it is providing there's a section that provides grants to law enforcement agencies to sort of create these hotlines and these different support systems. But at the end of the day, we are funneling more money into police systems. And so it's jarring to me how we can go from defunding the police and abolish the police to providing them with more money than ever in the span of a year. Right. And so it's really, and I wonder who was in those conversations, who was really building those, writing out those bills and laws, and what perspectives were considered in the making of that bill. Because I do think that if there is a way to really streamline that kind of support directly to folks on the ground who are already doing this work. When I think about, particularly in Oakland, I think of the Black Organizing Project. I think of the Anti-Police Terror Project. The former BOP, they have successfully removed an entire school police department, the Oakland Unified School Police Department, due to their own organizing on the ground. Anti-Police Terror Project is also a local organization in Oakland that they have started a hotline, a mental health hotline for those as a resource to call instead of police, right? But those are severely underfunded and undervalued like community organizations and projects. And so if we can find ways to funnel resources and focus on community work that is one, both intersectional, and then two, already doing the work on the ground, then I feel like that is just better for everyone in these situations. If we're thinking about how can we really and truly like dismantle a carceral system that exists in society. So we really just have to be analytical, I guess, of all the different angles that, for example, a piece of legislation can have on a community.
Thank you. I don't know, TK, if you have anything to add, otherwise I could jump to our final question. And since we really only have a minute, I'm going to take moderator privilege and say, we're going to do a lightning round here and ask each one of you to say, if there was one thing you would ask non-AAPI educators and colleagues to do that would help combat the model minority myth and to support AAPI students and peers, and I will add colleagues, what would that one thing be? And TK, you're sort of half smiling. So I'm thinking that that might mean you know.
Just one thing. I feel like, there's so much to unpack. I would say do not place the sole burden of unpacking race and racism on people of color. White people just have just as much responsibility to unpack race to their children, to their students, just as people of color have been doing so with their children the moment they've learned how to talk and understand the implications of their race.
Thank you. How about you, Kat?
I would say spend the time, energy, and resources to educate yourself without putting the burden on the people you were trying to learn about. So I'm thinking that specifically with Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, spend the time to research. The internet is amazing. Instagram alone will like teach you a whole dissertation. So spend the time and without putting the burden on those you're trying to learn from.
Leangelo.
Yeah, I think all of those things are really important. I think that you have to do the work. You have to like take the time to, do your research. Google is still free for now. And so definitely use that resource, but also, show yourself some grace. This work is hard. This work probably will not, these issues probably won't be resolved in our lifetime. And it is a long road. It is an intergenerational road. And so it really is important to, show yourself some grace, show yourself some care for yourself in this work, because it is exhausting. Burnout is very real. And so we do have to make sure we're taking our time. The issues are urgent, but at the same time, we can't, if we're not sustaining ourselves, how can we sustain a whole community, right? So just, that's where I would leave it. Yeah.
Well, I could not say it better, and I know we are out of time. And so let me thank each of our panelists, Leangelo Acuna, Kat Ling, and Takeru Tike Nagayoshi. Thank you, Lucy, the Hunt Institute, for having us, and to help our audience navigate those questions, Lucy is going to share some resources that the Hunt Institute has prepared. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. This was such a good conversation. I am so appreciative to our panelists and to Representative Santos for having this conversation. I think it was incredibly important. We do have many resources available on our website. The slide that you're currently looking at is our upcoming webinars, but we have many resources specifically related to this issue and equity in education and how we can support all students from an equity lens. So feel free to check out our website for those. We hope to see you for some of our upcoming events. These are just 3, but there are many more after. So I hope you'll stay tuned. Additionally, there will be a survey that pops up when you exit out of this webinar. We hope that you'll take it to help us continually improve to make sure that we are providing content that benefits you. And on that note, we are done. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you soon. Have a great rest of your day.